Welcome back to the Wargamers Workshop. Today we're going to be painting up some Legion Astartes infantry in the colours of the Sons of Horus. I'll show you some of my tricks for painting up Legions Imperialis scale infantry, as well as some optional steps that you can take to really make these tiny troops pop. I'll also be painting up the Terminators as Justaran Terminators, the pride of the 16th Legion. So make sure to hang around to the end so you don't miss them. In a similar fashion to when I painted up my Solar Auxilia troops, I'm going to be painting up these Legion Astartes troops using paddle pop sticks and double-sided tape. I find this gives really good access, allowing you to paint all of the infantry very easily, and you're able to prime and paint them while still leaving the bases paint-free, which means you can use plastic cement to glue them onto the base relatively easily. One tip though, make sure to clip the infantry out according to the bases that they belong on. You should have 5 models per paddle pop stick. That way, you don't need to try and figure out which troops go together when they're all painted. Now, just a reminder, if you are enjoying the content, please consider giving this video a like. Now that we have these attached, let's take them to my airbrush and prime and base coat them. We start with a quick coat of Vallejo's Mecha Air Grey Primer with a small amount of flow improver to prevent it from drying inside the airbrush. I'm using a 0.5mm nozzle here for priming the minis. I've recently swapped over from a 0.35mm nozzle on my cheap priming airbrush, and the results have been really good. No clogs, and it covers large areas quickly, though I suppose that's not really important here. We also prime the bases as well as the infantry. I like to prime my bases via the airbrush ahead of time, but not to worry, plastic cement still seems to work fine for attaching these little tiny minis onto the base. Next up, we lay down a base coat on all of the infantry minus the Terminators using Ruinous Spell from the Army Painter's Air Paint range. This green is an excellent foundation for any Sons of Horus troops. We then follow this up using Elemental Bolt as a zenithal highlight. Before we wrap up with the airbrush, we'll also base coat the Terminators using matte black, followed by a zenithal highlight of Raven Black. And now we can move on to some brush painting. Contrast is so important on Legions Imperialis scale minis, particularly troops, because they're so small when viewed on the tabletop. So to give these troops just that little bit more definition, we use purple tone as a shade, just depositing some in darker areas of the mini. So that's areas like under the head, under the arms, and under the backpacks. The capillary action of these washes really helps, as it helps to carry the pigments into the recesses. I really like using a purple shade with the green of the Sons of Horus. I find it really creates a nice shadow colour. Now don't worry about being too neat, because we'll quickly fix up any small overflows later on. Okay, so from here on, I'm going to be focusing on one type of infantry at a time just to keep things easy to follow. I'd really encourage you though to batch paint these infantry, it makes it a lot faster. We're going to be starting with the command base, as these have by far the most variety in the sculpts, and most of the other troops share a lot in common with the various troops in the command base. So first up, we start with matte black, and we're going to be using this for the bolters, painting up the Volkite pistol on the Praetor, and the chain blade, as well as the studded shoulder pads on each of the individual troops. There's also a couple of small cables on the Praetor, and we're going to be painting them black as well. We also paint both the front and the back of the banner black, and we're going to be putting a decal on there a little bit later. Now after this, you can optionally give the edges on the green armor a really quick highlight using Talisman Teal. I find this stage is pretty quick, but it really does help with establishing some definition on these minis. Especially for the command base, it's worth spending just that little bit of extra time to get a really nice result. For the command squad, I focused on highlighting the edges of the shoulder pad, the edges of the chest plate, and the top of the head. After this, we move on to painting up some red details. For this, we're going to be using a couple of coats of Blood Chalice from the Cool Reds triad. Now I found that it really needed a couple of coats to establish a good red colour over the green. We used this for painting up the cape on the Praetor along with the plumes on the different troops. Next up, we move on to the metallics, and so we're going to be starting with Shining Silver. We used this paint to paint the sword on the Praetor, the blades on both the chainblade bayonets as well as the chain blade, and we also use this for painting up the vents on the backpacks that are visible and the poles on the banner. Afterwards, we follow up with some tarnished gold, which we're going to be using to paint the trim on the Praetor, along with the studs on the shoulder pads, and the remaining details on the banner. So at this point, we're finished with the command squad. So let's move on to the other types of troops, and I'll show you how I painted each of them. The Tactical Marines are much simpler than the command squad. We're going to be starting with matte black for their bolters, their studded shoulder pads, as well as the ridges on the back of their armour. On the weapons, I like to paint a thick black line along the top, approximately the width of a bolter, leaving the rest green. This really helps to mask the undercuts when you're viewing them from a distance. Also, when painting the bolters, try not to paint over the hand that's under the bolter, it's pretty small. We then paint the plume on the leader for this group using 2 coats of Blood Chalice. As with the command squad, we paint up the chainblade bayonets and the exhaust vents on the backpack using Shining Silver. And then we finish this up using tainted gold on the studs on the shoulder pads. For the infantry with the plasma rifles, the only real difference is that we paint their plasma rifles with Shining Silver, including the coils, and then we use a few coats of radiation glow on the coils, slightly spilling it over to create a bit of a glowing effect. Likewise, for the missile launcher troops, they're actually pretty similar to a regular tactical marine. We're going to be using black to paint up the missile launchers, and then painting a small section of silver on the end. For the assault marines, we paint up their jetpacks in matte black, along with their studded shoulder pads, their chainswords, the hilt of the axe, and all of their bolt pistols. We'll then use some Shining Silver to paint up the edges of the chain blade, the barrel of the bolt pistol, along with some details on the top of the jetpack. Now, to help give those big black jetpacks just a little bit more detail, I also use some deep grey as an edge highlight. Once again, this is completely optional, but I think it makes a huge difference to the readability of these minis. And now for the Justaeran Terminators. So these are the elite Terminators of the Sons of Horus, and they wear black and red armour with a decayed golden sort of trim. So first up, we'll start painting one of the shoulder pads red using Blood Chalice, along with the straps hanging from the belt and the shoulders, as well as the shield on the captain. Next up, we paint the trim of the armour on the shoulders, the head, the chest, and the legs using tainted gold. We'll also use this to paint up the head of the Warhammer. We also use a small amount of Shining Silver to paint up the barrels of the weapons along with the drums. And lastly, we do a small amount of edge highlighting just on the top of each mini, using deep grey for the black areas and pure red for the red shoulder pad. And there you have it, all finished painting an entire sprue of Legion Astartes infantry, ready for them to join the battle. All up, we painted 9 bases worth of infantry, and there's plenty of diversity in those different types of units. I have to say, I am thrilled with how these turned out. The combination of using a purple wash along with some really quick edge highlighting, really brings these tiny troops to life. It's amazing how such small details on the tiny minis really can make such a big difference when viewing them on the tabletop. Now, speaking of details, I can't help but rave about the command base. These 5 unique sculpts were a lot of fun to paint, each packing in a lot of character and detail for such small models. It really is worth spending a good chunk of time painting up the command squad. I really think the payoff is worth it. One little trick I used on the banner was to apply a transfer and then paint over it using gold paint, which helped me to avoid needing to paint it freehand. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you found it helpful, please give it a like and consider subscribing if you want to see more painting videos like this one. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to catch you in my next video.